Historians have read it. What's a devastating event that no one talks about?
Galveston, Texas was once considered to be one of the most important commercial ports in the United States and was referred to by several fantastical names such as the Queen City of the Gulf and the Wall Street of the West. All that changed when it suffered a near-direct hit from a devastating Category 4 hurricane in 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Pretty much the entire city was destroyed by a storm surge and anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people died. Galveston was rebuilt but it never truly regained its status. Houston became the state's commercial center in the storm's wake.
There's a great book about this called Isaac Storm by Eric Larson.
I remember watching a documentary on this in school. There was one guy who could tell there was a storm coming. He tried to warn people but not a lot of people believed him and there wasn't enough time to evacuate the whole city by then.
The Texas City explosion of 1947 is also not widely known despite being the biggest industrial accident in U.S. history and one of the largest non-nuclear explosions of all time, especially relevant considering its similarities to the Beirut disaster.
Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969 even after Hawaii officially became a state.
Weren't a lot of them also more or less tossed from their boats and made to climb cliffs to even get to the island? I listened to a podcast about this and can't remember exactly. Also, descendants on the island had to fight to keep their homes once leprosy wasn't a threat and people wanted the land to make money.
So true. The podcast I listened to about this is called, This Podcast Will Kill You. http://thispodcastwillkillyou.com, http://thispodcastwillkillyou.com.
A similar thing happened on an island called Panikese near New England.
I'll have to look it up. Currently getting my MPH on infectious disease with research focus on cultural bias, support.
There's a really good book about this called Molokai by Alan Brennett.
One thing that doesn't get talked about was more of a phenomenon or major problem than event, and that was how many people died in theater fires due to poor design, combustible materials, few fire exits, and panic. One of the worst was the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, 1903, which is both the deadliest theater fire and the deadliest single-building fire in U.S. history, where patrons died after a sparks from an arc light set a curtain on fire. Then a chain reaction started, exacerbated by failures of the things in place that were supposed to combat fire. The theater had been overbooked to compensate for earlier poor sales, causing some to sit blocking the exits. The fire was immediately worsened when performers opened the stage door to get outside, as it turned the fire into a fireball. Many people were held inside by iron gates that had been put in place to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. As people fled, they tumbled downstairs, trampled each other, got squashed to death. Their unfamiliarity with the building got them stuck in dead ends and up against windows. Many jumped from fire escapes and died, while those behind them were saved, the bodies of the earlier jumpers cushioning their falls. All in all, 602 people died, many were children. The story is a lot more complicated and sordid with city corruption, etc. The one takeaway is the incident promoted the development and use of the panic bar. Ad. Sorry, this is so poorly written. I was trying to write it really fast in my phone. Ad. Thanks to everyone who is providing more stories and info for me to look at. I love it.
Beverly Hills Supper Club, Kentucky, and the Station Nightclub recent with color video are additional examples. Fire codes are written in blood.
I just saw a YouTube video on the Beverly Hills Supper Club a couple weeks ago. It was the first time I'd heard of it. Now that one was a total nightmare with the floor plan and how quickly it went up. You'd had to have responded to the very first hint of a problem to have had a chance of getting out.
I manage a school theater, and all of my students learn about this one. One thing I point out is that a lot of the same fire safety devices and procedures we have now existed then, but were defeated. Fire hatches in the roof should have prevented the backdraft, but were nailed shut. The fire curtain was blocked, and built so poorly it wouldn't have helped anyway. If they're still interested, I cover the Station Nightclub fire as well.
I apologize that I wrote this so crappily. Lol, it's so detailed that it's hard to give a high-level version. I first learned about Iroquois when I was researching the architect, Benjamin Marshall. Apparently, he was so upset at how badly the fire protocol went for this theater that he vowed never to design another theater, or something. I did this research 10 years ago. Anyway, he did go on to collaborate with the Schubert brothers to design their theater in St. Paul, MN, 1910. The bros bragged that their theaters were the most fireproof in the country. And they were because everything was concrete or metal. So Marshall did end up redeeming himself from the Iroquois disaster.
In 535, humans went through hell. Many reported a strange color in the skies, not just in Europe. A dense, dry fog was also reported in Asia and the Middle East. Even the regions now known as the Americas weren't spared. E.g. drought in Peru. Temperatures were rather low in some places. It snowed either in the summertime. One survivor, a Roman politician named Cassiodorus, explained about the bluish sun and no shadows being cast, even in the noon. It has been hypothesized that Iceland holds the reason for the events between the years 535 and 536. Iceland is known for its volcanoes, and it was possible one such was to blame. Edit. Thanks for the sliver.
Something similar happened in 1816, the year without a summer, that was caused by a volcano in Indonesia erupting in 1815.
And then less than a decade later the Justinian plague hit in 541. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, it was less than a decade after an infamous mass famine. Seems like volcanoes cause the earth to cool, mass crop failures and mass starvation happens. Lack of nutrition destroys people's immune systems, and so plague then ravages through.
Classic Iceland. In Vikings were probably up there on their rocky little island like, Hilda, it's unseasonably warm, let us leave our putty turf house for 20 minutes. Jor Orsten, the soil is particularly fertile since that mountain exploded, while everyone else in the entire globe was freaking the F out.
The year 536 marked the beginning of a very bad time period. https://www.sciencemag.org/news/2018/11/y-536- was-worst-year-b-alive. Basically several natural disasters and social upheaval absolutely devastated multiple societies. It's thought that a volcanic eruption blocked out enough sun to cause crop failures across Europe and as far as China. While this was happening, terrible plagues were also afflicting the Middle East. Economies everywhere fell to ruin and stagnation in the years that followed because several other eruptions later made things worse.
Cambodian genocide. They killed so many kids that the life expectancy was 18.
They killed people with glasses for being intellectuals too, IIRC.
There's so many that I would go with, that will probably be mentioned in other comments. But I think any stories about workers in the early 1900s are pretty horrible. Radium Girls, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/radium_girls is a pretty horrible event. For example, greater than after being told that the paint was harmless, the women in each facility ingested deadly amounts of radium after being instructed to point their brushes on their lips in order to give them a fine tip. Some also painted their fingernails, face and teeth with the glowing substance. The women were instructed to point their brushes in this way because using rags or a water rinse caused them to use more time and material, as the rinse was made from powdered radium, gum arabic and water. Many women died and became sick with horrendous diseases. One woman named Molly Maggie had her jawbone crumble. You can read about that here. https://allthat'sinteresting.com/radium-girls/4. Greater than by May, her dentist thought Molly needed surgery to remove a fast-growing abscess he'd found on her jaw. When he got the gums open, the bone didn't look right as it was too ashy and gray, so he gently prodded it with his finger. To his shock and horror, the whole bone crumbled under his fingertip like ashes in a fireplace. Greater than instead of removing a tumor, he wound up digging Molly's entire left jaw out with nothing but his fingers. Unbeknownst to him, the radium had perforated the bone cells and stripped them of calcium. It had, like a little machine gun, shredded the collagen inside the bone and left it as little more than a pile of splinters. There's also a great book on this called The Radium Girls: The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore. This whole story is extremely depressing. Work in the 1800s and early 1900s was pretty horrible for a lot of women, men and children. Brew wenches, female miners in the 19th century. You can look that up, children in chimney sweeps etc.
This whole story is just so sad. And the saddest part is that these women were literally fighting for compensation on their deathbeds, and only a few received justice before they died. Talk about manipulating vulnerable people into doing your dirty work. There's a movie coming about it soon with Joey King.
I'll keep that movie on my watch list. Hopefully they keep it historically accurate. Thank you. I think that's the worst part about a lot of these stories in the 1800s or early 1900s about workers. Most of them didn't get any sort of justice. It was like, well, that happened. Sucks but good luck. To be fair, that happened throughout history, but still. It gets really grim when it goes into anything to do with children. The amount of abuse they suffered in different ways is something a lot of people couldn't even nightmare up.
I've read that book, it's just horrifying. The worst part for me was during one of the trials. A doctor was testifying, reading the medical records of one patient, and came to the end where he said the prognosis was terminal. Suddenly someone started screaming. It was the woman whose medical records were being read. None of the doctors had told her she was dying, so that's how she found out.
The Bronze Age collapse. Arguably more devastating than the fall of the West Roman Empire. So much knowledge lost. Truly one of history's great mysteries. I recommend reading up on it. It's really interesting.
Until I learned about it, I had no idea that there was once a whole other Dark Ages that happened before what we normally think of as the Dark Ages, although that term is a misnomer. The Bronze Age collapse ushered in a centuries-long Dark Age that lasted until classical Greece.
Apparently climate change played a part in things too, with the sea peoples migrating southward to a more bearable climate, being met with hostility, and utterly bitch-slapping several civilizations that stood in their way. Only ones that stood against them were the Egyptians, and even then, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Not to mention a bunch of Mycenaeans getting pissed at their local rulers and staging rebellions and popular uprisings, further destabilizing their entire kingdom.
Yep, these are some of the more common theories. But the fact is that we know very little from this time since there was a significant drop in literacy.
The Highland clearances. Over a period of about 150 years between the 18th and 19th centuries, English and Lowland Scottish landlords evicted thousands upon thousands of Highland Scots from their ancestral homelands and replaced them with sheep. It's hard to classify as a historical event because it went on for so long and is usually interpreted as an ambiguous series of largely isolated incidents. There were attacks on villages in which the landlords would burn their tenants' houses to the ground to get them to leave, and burned their land so that nothing could grow. Multiple people were caught in the fires and died. During the Glencoe massacre, 30 members of Clan MacDonald were murdered by Scottish government forces for supporting the Jacobite uprising. The Irish potato famine also affected the Highland Scots who grew potatoes, and many people starved or were forced to leave as well. As a result, there was a series of mass migration in which Scots travelled to Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the US, and largely lost their language and culture. It's very sad, and all that is basically why Highland culture and language has largely been lost. Edit. Holy frick, thank you so much for the award. Edit again. Frickin' heck, another one. Thank you so very much.
Greater than as a result, there was a series of mass migration in which Scots traveled to Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the US, and largely lost their language and culture. While it wasn't directly related to the clearances, during this period there was also an attempt to wipe out minor British languages. One of those was Shetlandic, where the last native speaker died less than 50 years ago. Edit. This comment put me down a rabbit hole. Shetland Dialect Online Dictionary. https://www.shetland-dialect.org.uk/john-j-grams-shetland-dictionary.php ?
It definitely was related. That point in time correlated with a million other indigenous language bashing efforts, just like you said. Shetlandic is similar to Scots, isn't it? I've only ever heard one woman speaking it. The Mayan society and the lost scriptures that we still haven't found on top of the scriptures we still can't seem to decipher.
and basically just how much culture was torched by Spain during the Conquista and the colonial period. Frankly, I'm amazed the Maya language is still alive.
Agreed. It's something we need to talk more about, like the Babylonians. I mean, could they have really torched it all?
Asked my history studying friend about this, she said there's a lot of events that people don't talk about. For example, there was a lot of countries involved in the Balkan conflict who knew about the massacre of Srebrenica but still allowed it to happen. So many historical events are just so grim and depressing when you read about it. We knew bad things were happening but didn't stop until it was too late for many people.
The role of the Netherlands in the massacre is often heavily overlooked when this massacre is taught honestly.
Same with the Rwandan genocide. The UN knew and yet just watched as all those people died.
A bit like what's happening in China right now.
The disease outbreaks that hit the Americas with the arrival of the Europeans. You hear about a 90% death rate and it sounds made up, but whatever the actual number was, entire civilizations were literally wiped out. Cultures that had existed for thousands of years are just gone, with barely a record left. You have stories of people coming across whole villages of corpses. These people died never even having seen the Europeans, never knowing what was killing them and their loved ones, and totally helpless to do anything about it.
The De Soto expedition, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/hernando_de_soto-de_north_america, and the Narvaez-C3%A1es_expedition of the southeastern U.S. found significant settlements and a strong culture on the Mississippi River that chased the Spanish out of the area. Half of the De Soto expedition died, and only 4 people from the Narvaez expedition survived. They didn't find any riches or suitable places for colonization, and instead just found tough native warriors. So there wasn't any desire to come back, and when exploration of the area resumed 100 years later, all those native civilizations were gone.
The book 1491 touches on this. Apparently Native Americans weren't a bunch of primitive nomadic tribes. There were cities and terraformed land and rich cultures, but when the Europeans arrived, diseases spread ahead of their advance, so by the time the Europeans would arrive in an area, it had already been decimated by epidemics and whoever was left was living in post-apocalyptic survival mode.
The sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff in 1945 was the most deadly civilian shipwreck in history. It was a passenger ship mostly carrying Polish, Lithuanian and Estonian World War II refugees. It was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. At least 9,400 people died, some estimates go up to 11,000. It's absolutely criminal that the Titanic gets so much more attention, although it was awful, obviously, when the Gustloff sinking killed nearly 10 times as many people. There's a spectacular historical fiction novel about it by Ruta Sepetys called *Salt to the Sea*. Highly recommend. It's very humanizing.
One horrific ending to an incredibly catastrophic 6 damn years.
It wasn't a refugee ship. It was a known military transport, was carrying significant numbers of soldiers and Nazi officials alongside purely ethnic German civilians, and was not distinguished in any way from non-combat ships, not even being stripped of its AA guns. It's less a preventable humanitarian disaster and more a reality check by the horrors of war.
China during WW2. The Japanese absolutely decimated the areas they occupied during the war, not just through RP and murder but through biological warfare that resulted in the slow death of hundreds of thousands of people largely forgotten by history. I'm not in any way a supporter of the current Chinese government, but I feel like whether it is a response not only to communist government tyranny of the Mao era, but to the horrific Japanese atrocities that allowed it to happen in the first place.
The number of people I've met who literally deny that the Nanjing massacre happened is insane. Ridiculous.
Not just the RP of Nanking. There's people who literally worked in Japanese biological weapons facilities that are responsible for direct torture and murder of subjects referred to colloquially as Maruta logs, that still to this day deny any wrongdoing. Scores of people were abducted, tortured and eventually killed to fuel Imperial Japan's warfare endeavors. And yet so many war criminals were allowed to basically just walk away at the end of it all just because of the growing fear of communism.
Yeah, people talk about how terrible Nazi Germany is, and they truly do deserve it. But I'm not sure how many Westerners truly understand how psychopathic Imperial Japan was when it came to how it treated its imperial holdings and carried out its war effort. Systemic, borderline industrialized mass RP in Korea, for example. Not that the Western imperial powers were all that better a few decades, centuries prior.
The blinding of 15,000 soldiers. The Bulgarians and Byzantines would clash every couple of years, and after one battle the Byzantine leader just snapped and cut out the eyes of the soldiers that surrendered, then sent them back home. The Bulgarian leader died upon hearing the news.
1% get lucky, only one eye removed. We actually learned that in school.
No, this is wildly over-exaggerated, and the emperor didn't just snap. Basil II, or Basil the Bulgar Slayer, was the emperor of the Roman Empire in the early 1000s AD and is largely considered one of the greatest Roman emperors. He is largely famous for his completion of the reconquest of the Bulgarian Empire. A difficult campaign that took up most of his life due to the mountainous Macedonian country he was fighting in. During one of these campaigns, he captured a contingent of Bulgarian troops, size unknown. He then proceeded to blind 99 out of 100 of them and left the last man with one eye to guide the rest back home. No one is sure if this story is true or not, but we can say for sure that 15,000 troops is a huge overstatement. It was unlikely that the Bulgarians were even able to muster 5,000 troops. At the end of the day, this is just a myth, maybe based in some truth, that has been over-exaggerated throughout the years.
Thank you for watching. We upload new videos every day, so be sure to come back for more fun. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the video.